Get out of that seat before I call security. First class isn't for standby passengers." The voice sliced through the polished silence of the cabin like a sharp knife against velvet, loud enough that every passenger in Atlas Aero Executive's luxury jet heard it, even those who pretended to keep scrolling on their phones. Captain Mark Stanton stood firm, blocking the aisle in his crisp Navy uniform, gold stripes gleaming on his cuffs, his expression cold and certain as he pointed directly at Ava Carter, who sat still and composed in seat 1A. The hum of the idle engines provided a muted backdrop as his accusation hung in the air, heavier than the plush leather seats and polished wood walls surrounding them. Just 2 rows back, Howard Gaines let out a low chuckle, shaking his head with a smirk that dripped disdain. His designer coat draped perfectly over the armrest, as if this moment merely confirmed what he already believed about people like her. Another passenger looked away quickly, eyes locked on his glowing screen, but his hunched posture betrayed that he too was listening carefully. All of them were. The whole cabin had become a quiet theater, watching an unspoken test unfold, one that Ava Carter recognized instantly because she had seen it before, in countless boardrooms, conference halls, and private lounges. Ava's hands rested lightly in her lap, fingers interlaced without tension, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze steady but unreadable as she slowly lifted her eyes to meet Stanton's glare. Her dark jeans, plain gray sweater, and unbranded white sneakers spoke no luxury, no obvious status, no signs of privilege that would have disarmed his suspicion, and that absence of symbols had sealed his conclusion before he spoke a single word. What Captain Stanton didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Ava Carter didn't just buy a ticket on this aircraft, she owned the aircraft itself, owned the Atlas Aero Executive brand that painted its fuselage, and owned the very terminal where this confrontation was unfolded. Yet in this moment, she made no move to assert any of that, offering no badge, no explanation, no rescue by status. Because she wasn't here to be recognized, she was here to observe exactly this, the reflexes of a crew and clientele when faced with a black woman who didn't signal her worth through tailored suits and expensive accessories. Mark Stanton's posture stiffened further as Ava remained silent, mistaking her calm for acquiescence. He took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough to feign civility while ensuring the insult carried to everyone around them. "Do you have a premium verification code? Because unless someone scanned you in by mistake, you're in the wrong seat," he said with deliberate contempt, punctuating his words by glancing toward the nearby passengers as if to gather their unspoken support. Ava allowed the question to hang in the air, lifting her gaze slowly to take in the entire cabin, polished mahogany panels, gold-plated fixtures, and the 6 other passengers frozen in a mix of discomfort and complicity. She felt the heat of their glances but did not flinch, did not adjust her seatbelt, did not reach for any document to justify her presence. At that precise moment, Howard Gaines leaned forward from across the aisle, tapping Ava's modest carry-on with the tip of his expensive leather shoe, nudging it aside with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to staking his claim without consequence. "Don't block the aisle," he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for all to hear. "Some of us actually paid to be here." The ripple of discomfort that followed didn't bring with it any words of objection, only shifting glances and subtle nods that signaled tacit approval, or at least unwillingness to intervene. Ava inhaled deeply, slow and steady, grounding herself in this familiar landscape of judgment, a landscape she had navigated since her earliest days as the lone black woman at countless executive tables. But this time, she wasn't here simply to endure it. Susan Bell, the lead flight attendant, stood behind Captain Stanton, her polished smile brittle and rehearsed, her hands clasped too tightly behind her back as she waited for the inevitable outcome, eyes darting occasionally toward the cockpit where First Officer Paul Kendrick peeked out, uncertain but silent. The stillness of the scene was deceptive. Beneath its surface, tension coiled tighter with every second that Ava refused to move, refused to speak, refused to rise and quietly exit as they expected. Mark Stanton's expression hardened, and his voice rose one notch louder, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear clearly. "You'll need to exit the aircraft now, Ms." He paused, realizing he hadn't even asked her name, then continued coldly, "before we call security to remove you." In that pause, Howard Gaines chuckled again, this time emboldened enough to speak directly. "Looks like some people think first class is for anyone now." His words a pointed barb meant not just for Ava, but for every onlooker silently watching. And as those words settled in the cabin's charged air, as glances averted and complicit silence deepened, Ava Carter remained seated, silent, composed, but beneath that stillness burned a quiet fire of resolve. Because this wasn't about a seat, and it never had been. It was about dignity, and the next 30 minutes would teach them all exactly who they had tried to remove. Captain Mark Stanton didn't wait for a reply as he squared his shoulders and stepped even closer, his polished shoes nearly brushing the tips of Ava Carter's plain white sneakers, his glare fixed and sharp as a blade drawn in judgment. His voice dropped to a tone that mimicked professional courtesy, but couldn't mask the contempt lacing every syllable. "If you were supposed to be here, Ms. Carter, if that is your name, you'd have shown proper documentation by now. But clearly," he said, turning deliberately toward the nearby passengers, inviting their agreement with a raised eyebrow, "that isn't the case." Howard Gaines smirked broadly, his posture slack but his eyes gleaming with petty triumph, emboldened by Stanton's lead as he tapped the metal badge pinned to his tailored blazer, a faux VIP executive medallion he'd likely commissioned himself, flashing it ostentatiously toward the cockpit as if deputizing himself to speak on behalf of everyone who belonged here. "This is what happens when we let anyone into first class," he announced, voice pitched just loud enough to carry to every seat, each word a calculated insult draped in faux sophistication. Ava Carter absorbed every detail, the mockery in Howard's tone, the way Captain Stanton's eyes narrowed with quiet satisfaction, and how the cabin fell into that particular kind of hush that was not truly silent but filled with invisible consent. Averted gazes, tightened grips on armrests, and the studied pretense of disinterest that was itself an act of complicity. Susan Bell stepped forward now, her brittle composure cracking slightly as she added, "Captain, if she won't produce proper verification, we're delaying departure. The other passengers shouldn't have to wait." Her words were polite on the surface, but her clipped cadence betrayed impatience, her tone dripping with the assumption that Ava was not merely out of place, but an inconvenience. Ava's gaze swept across the cabin again, taking in the rows of polished mahogany trim and gold-plated fixtures, the curated aura of refinement that served as the perfect camouflage for the prejudice unfolding so brazenly within its walls. Her fingers remained still in her lap, but inside her chest, her breath moved deliberately, each inhale a reminder that she had nothing to prove to these people, nothing to explain, nothing to justify. But the indignities continued. Mark Stanton gestured toward her modest carry-on, now pushed awkwardly to the side by Howard Gaines's careless foot. "You'll need to take your belongings and disembark," Stanton declared, raising his voice slightly so that even passengers at the rear could hear the finality in his tone. His words left no space for conversation, no invitation for clarification, only the unmistakable message that Ava did not belong and would not be permitted to remain seated among them. Howard leaned forward again, voice laced with mock concern but sharpened like a weapon. "Try, coach," he whispered, before adding more loudly for effect, "Fraud." A ripple of discomfort passed through the cabin as some passengers exchanged uneasy glances, the mood shifting subtly but unmistakably as tension thickened. Yet no one spoke. No one objected. No one interceded. Their silence was a verdict in itself. Mark Stanton folded his arms now, standing fully upright with an air of finality. "Last warning," he said coldly. "If you're not verified within the next 60 seconds, we will remove you before wheels up. That's company policy, ma'am." Ava Carter let the words wash over her, registering not only their content but their intent, an attempt to strip her of dignity, to force her into a defensive posture, to compel her to validate her presence to an audience that had already passed judgment. But what Mark Stanton, Howard Gaines, and the complicit silence of the cabin didn't understand, at least not yet, was that Ava Carter had chosen this seat precisely to witness these reflexes in real time. She didn't shift, she didn't blink, she didn't speak. Not yet. As the tension thickened around her like the heavy air before a summer storm, Ava Carter remained motionless, her stillness almost unnerving in contrast to the escalating arrogance swirling around her. Captain Mark Stanton cast a sharp glance toward Victor Crane, the burly security officer standing at the rear of the cabin, and with a terse nod signaled that his patience had officially expired. Victor began to shift his stance, adjusting his radio as if preparing for action. But before he could take a step forward, a soft but firm voice broke the silence. Devon Walsh, seated 2 rows behind Ava, leaned forward in his seat, his expression tight with discomfort, but his voice steady. "Captain," he said carefully, "I think you might want to reconsider. This feels wrong." His words hung in the air, tentative yet significant, like the first crack in a dam holding back a flood. Mark Stanton's head snapped around, his glare sharpening, as if to remind Devon that this was not his place to interfere. But Devon didn't shrink back. If anything, his voice grew steadier. "She hasn't done anything to warrant this. Why are you escalating this so quickly?" Tara Monroe, sitting beside Devon with her arms crossed and her brow furrowed in concern, added, "This doesn't look good. You haven't even asked for her name properly, haven't checked anything officially. Are you sure this is the right call?" Mark Stanton's lips pressed into a thin line, his authority suddenly feeling less absolute, but he doubled down nonetheless. "We're simply enforcing policy," he snapped, though the brittleness in his voice betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. "The integrity of this flight depends on order and verification." Howard Gaines let out another derisive chuckle, clearly emboldened by Stanton's persistence, and waved his faux VIP badge once more, as if that alone made him an arbiter of belonging. "Some folks just don't understand how first class works," he drawled, directing a pointed glance toward Ava's simple gray sweater and dark jeans, his tone dripping condescension. Susan Bell, standing stiffly near the galley, took this as her cue to escalate further. "Captain Stanton," she interjected crisply, "I recommend we move to have her removed immediately. She's disrupting cabin readiness, delaying departure. We can't have this kind of uncertainty on a premium flight." At that moment, Corey Blake, a younger man seated toward the rear of the cabin, raised his phone tentatively, thumb hovering over the record button but hesitating as he caught Tara's eye. Tara shook her head gently but firmly. "Talk," she whispered. "Don't post. If there's a line to be held, we hold it with our voices." Corey nodded slowly, lowering the phone, but his eyes remained locked on the scene unfolding before him. A scene that was no longer just about one woman and a seat, but about a deeper, uglier reflex that had gripped the entire cabin. Nia Turner, sitting across the aisle from Ava, finally spoke too, her voice soft but clear, her gaze steady. "This feels familiar," she murmured, loud enough for those nearest her to hear. "I've seen this before, and it's always the same look. The same assumptions." Victor Crane hesitated mid-step, torn between following orders and absorbing the growing unease spreading through the passengers who had begun to shift in their seats, some leaning forward, some exchanging concerned glances, but most still unwilling to speak aloud. Ava Carter turned her head slightly toward Devon Walsh, her voice so quiet it barely rose above the hum of the cabin systems, but every syllable cut through the air with precision. "Then don't watch it happen," she said, her gaze locking on his with a weight that demanded action, not just observation. But even as those few voices began to rise, hesitant, awkward, but sincere, Mark Stanton remained resolute, his jaw set, his authority threatened but unyielding. "Security," he called over his shoulder, voice louder now, deliberately performative, as if determined to reclaim the narrative by sheer volume. "Prepare to remove this passenger immediately. We will not delay further." Victor took a tentative step forward again, but the discomfort on his face was plain now, his movements slower, his confidence fraying at the edges. He wasn't alone. The entire cabin seemed to teeter on the brink of something larger. Some invisible threshold where casual indifference could no longer hold. And yet Ava Carter still sat perfectly still, perfectly silent. Her calm composure a quiet challenge in itself, a deliberate refusal to explain, to justify, to offer any convenient proof that might let them all off the hook for what they were revealing about themselves in real time. The second layer of tension had settled into the cabin fully now, a layer not just of arrogance, but of doubt, hesitation, and the first faint stirrings of conscience among a handful of passengers. But the reflex of power, embodied by Mark Stanton, Susan Bell, and Howard Gaines, remained intact, still pressing forward, still demanding her removal as though their authority was immutable. They did not yet know that they were standing on the edge of their own undoing. Victor Crane took a measured breath as he stepped closer, his hand brushing against the radio on his shoulder, the subtle tension in his frame betraying that he was preparing to act. Captain Mark Stanton's tone hardened, words clipped and cold as he delivered his final ultimatum. "You have 60 seconds to vacate that seat, ma'am. I won't ask again." Howard Gaines settled back into his leather seat, arms crossed, wearing a smirk of smug satisfaction as he glanced around the cabin, silently inviting the others to join in his mockery. But Ava Carter didn't move. Instead, she calmly lifted her wrist, tapped her smartwatch, and spoke quietly but deliberately. "Simone, begin Protocol 7. Her voice cut clean through the tension, quiet but firm, and her choice of words left most of the passengers exchanging confused glances. Who was Simone? What was Protocol 7? Only Ava knew, and she intended to let them sit in that uncertainty. Within a heartbeat, a smooth female voice responded from the device. Calm, efficient, unmistakably authoritative. "Standing by, Ms. Carter. Protocol 7. Initialized. Verbal log commencing." Captain Stanton stiffened, a flicker of doubt crossing his face for the first time, though he quickly masked it with a sneer. "And who exactly is Simone?" he asked, the sarcasm poorly veiling the unease creeping into his voice. Ava turned her head slowly, scanning the faces around her, some averted in shame, others wide-eyed with dawning recognition, and a few still clinging to skepticism. She let the moment stretch, watching the weight of her silence press down on them all. Then, locking eyes with Stanton, she spoke with precision. "Even if the company that designed this seat belongs to me?" The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was dense, filled with unspoken recalculations as the meaning of her words began to sink in. It was Howard Gaines who broke the silence first, laughing out loud, shaking his head as if her suggestion was absurd. "Please," he scoffed, his voice loud and dismissive. "You expect anyone here to believe that?" But Ava didn't flinch. She reached into her jacket pocket, pulled out her sleek black smartphone, and tapped a single button. The voice of Simone returned, this time with a message that shifted the atmosphere instantly. "Atlas Aero Executive Ownership Authority confirmed. Ms. Ava Carter, registered Chief Executive Officer and sole controlling owner of this aircraft and all related assets. Corporate monitoring active." Every passenger froze. Captain Stanton's expression faltered, the confidence draining from his face as quickly as the color in his cheeks. Susan Bell's eyes widened, her grip tightening around the safety manifest in her hands as she took a subtle but visible step backward. Even Victor Crane paused mid-step, looking from Ava to Stanton and then to Howard Gaines, his posture suddenly rigid but unsure. Howard's smug expression evaporated, replaced by a confused grimace as his gaze flicked from Ava's calm composure to the passengers around him, now murmuring in stunned disbelief. Ava remained perfectly still, but her eyes gleamed with a quiet, undeniable authority. She hadn't needed to raise her voice, to flash credentials, or to demand recognition. Her power was absolute, and it had arrived precisely when she intended. Then she spoke again, her tone cool and deliberate. "You didn't even ask my name," she said, her words cutting through Stanton's defenses like a scalpel. "You didn't think it mattered." Mark Stanton opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time, the captain of this flight was completely disarmed, not by aggression or argument, but by the crushing realization that he had made a grave, public mistake. Devon Walsh rose fully from his seat, his voice clear and resolute. "You have no idea who you've been speaking to, Captain." And with that, the entire atmosphere in the cabin shifted. The weight of arrogance that had filled the air dissipated, replaced by the heavy fog of shame, disbelief, and stunned silence. Ava Carter hadn't moved an inch from her seat. But she now sat at the very center of the cabin's attention, not as a suspected interloper, but as the owner of the very plane on which this entire drama had unfolded. The third escalation tier had arrived, and with it, the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. And yet, the clock on Ava's wrist continued counting down, because her 30 minutes of quiet revelation was far from over. The cabin remained heavy with stunned silence, every passenger acutely aware that the ground beneath their assumptions had shifted and kept shifting, as Ava Carter stayed calmly seated, letting the weight of her quiet authority fill the space. Victor Crane, still standing near the aisle, seemed visibly shaken now, his earlier readiness to act dissolving into hesitation. He looked toward Captain Stanton for further direction, but Stanton's rigid posture betrayed that he no longer felt sure of anything, least of all his authority. Ava turned her head slightly, her gaze resting squarely on Victor. She didn't need to speak yet. The silence itself demanded an answer. Victor swallowed hard, then broke the hush with a voice that was noticeably softer than before. "Captain, I think we need to pause. We might not have full context here." Mark Stanton spun toward him sharply, tone clipped and defensive. "No, we proceed. Policy's policy. If she's not on our manifest, we remove her." Victor didn't step forward, though. His feet remained planted, his brow furrowed, his posture uncertain now that the woman they had nearly ejected had just revealed herself as the most powerful person in the cabin and beyond. Then a second crack appeared. Paul Kendrick, the first officer who had hovered nervously at the cockpit doorway all this time, finally stepped fully into the aisle. His voice wavered but carried enough volume to pierce the tension. "Captain, I need to say something," he began, hands raised slightly in a gesture of surrender, as if acknowledging his part in what was unraveling. The cabin fell even quieter, the other passengers now riveted, not to a confrontation, but to a confession. "I was told to call security before you even gave the order," Paul admitted, his gaze darting briefly towards Susan Bell, then quickly looking down as if ashamed. "Susan told me to prepare to remove any unverified passenger before we even completed pre-flight checks." A collective intake of breath swept through the passengers, a rush of quiet shock as the truth behind the crew's reflexive response began to emerge. Ava didn't interrupt. She simply listened, her expression unreadable but her posture resolute, allowing the truth to surface on its own. Susan Bell stiffened, her polished professionalism suddenly threadbare. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but faltered when Tara Monroe, seated across the aisle, turned her gaze directly onto her. "Prepare to remove any unverified passenger," Tara repeated, her voice low but sharp. "Or did you mean any passenger who doesn't look the part?" Susan's lips parted again, but no words came. The silence condemned her far more effectively than anything she might have said. Then, unexpectedly, Victor Crane stepped forward, his shoulders squared but his voice filled with visible discomfort. "There's more," he said quietly, addressing Ava now, no longer pretending she was anyone other than the person who owned not just this aircraft, but the entire company that employed him. Before anyone could ask, Victor continued, almost as if confessing to clear a weight from his own conscience. 3 weeks ago, Susan distributed a new checklist to the security staff, a so-called cabin readiness protocol that told us to flag passengers based on dress and demeanor. He hesitated, then spoke the next words as if they physically hurt. It was coded language. We all knew it. It was about appearance, race, status, who looked like they belonged and who didn't. And gasps spread throughout the cabin now as passengers processed what Victor's admission meant. This wasn't an isolated mistake, nor was it the result of a single captain's prejudice. It was systemic, a deliberate, covert policy enforced beneath the veneer of professional procedure. Howard Gaines shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly realizing that his smug participation had occurred within a structure designed to enable exactly this kind of prejudice. Susan Bell finally spoke, her voice cracking at the edges. "That protocol, it was meant to protect the image of the cabin," she stammered, grasping for justification as her credibility crumbled. "High-profile clients expect a certain standard." Nia Turner, seated directly across from Susan, cut in without raising her voice, but her words were edged with clarity. "A standard," she said evenly, "that let you erase people before they even spoke." Devon Walsh, who had stood quietly until now, spoke next, directing his words not at Susan but at the entire cabin. "This isn't about one incident. It's about a pattern, a culture." His tone was firm, his expression grave, and today that culture got exposed. All the while Ava Carter sat in her seat, not triumphant, not gloating, but measured, precise, deliberate. Her silence had compelled honesty. Her patience had surfaced hidden truths. When she finally spoke again, her words were quiet, but they filled the cabin with a kind of gravity that felt unmistakable. "Bias doesn't require a policy manual," she said, her gaze steady and direct. "But once it becomes protocol, that's when silence becomes complicity." Mark Stanton looked away, his confidence shattered. Victor Crane lowered his head in shame. Susan Bell stood frozen, her veneer of control utterly stripped away. Even Howard Gaines, who had so openly mocked Ava just minutes before, remained speechless, staring at the floor as if suddenly realizing the depth of his own exposure. The cabin wasn't just witnessing an individual humiliation. It was witnessing the unraveling of an entire system of quiet, calculated exclusion. And Ava Carter hadn't raised her voice once. The cabin had shifted, no longer tense with unspoken prejudice, it was now heavy with reckoning, the walls themselves seeming to absorb the gravity of what had just unfolded. Ava Carter remained seated in 1A, her posture composed, her face still unreadable. But every eye was fixed on her. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't demanded respect, but her presence alone had become the center of gravity in this space. Victor Crane took a step back, his gaze lowered, no longer the confident security officer enforcing orders, but a man realizing the full weight of his participation. Paul Kendrick hovered near the cockpit door, eyes glassy, arms limp at his sides. Susan Bell stood rigid, arms crossed in a futile gesture of self-defense, while Mark Stanton gripped the back of the pilot's seat as if it might anchor him against the tide that was now undeniably against him. Howard Gaines sat in silence, all traces of smirk and arrogance gone, reduced to a man realizing that the very power he had flaunted minutes ago had evaporated. Then Ava finally moved. She didn't rush, didn't stand abruptly. Instead, she lifted her phone from her lap, tapped a single button, and spoke with the same calm clarity that had carried her through this ordeal. "Simone," she said, her tone smooth and resolute. "Issue the standing order." Simone's voice returned instantly, clear and precise. "Confirmed. Prepared for verbal directive." Ava's gaze swept the cabin, meeting every eye. Not with hostility, but with certainty. Then she spoke firmly, each word measured and deliberate, so that no one could claim later they didn't understand exactly what was happening. Effective immediately, Captain Mark Stanton, Susan Bell, Paul Kendrick, and Victor Crane, you are relieved of duty. Your employment with Atlas Aero Executive is terminated. A collective gasp swept through the cabin. Not of outrage, but of stunned acknowledgement that justice, long delayed, had just arrived swiftly and without hesitation. Susan Bell's composure cracked first. You can't fire us like this," she stammered, voice rising with desperation as she took an involuntary step forward. "In front of everyone?" Ava met her gaze evenly. "Exactly, in front of everyone," she said, her voice low but cutting. "Because you humiliated me in front of them." Mark Stanton's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His silence spoke volumes. Paul Kendrick buried his face in his hands, a soundless gesture of remorse that came too late. Victor Crane inhaled deeply, then nodded once, his voice soft but resigned. "Understood." Howard Gaines straightened in his seat, clearing his throat as if searching for some last scrap of control, but Ava didn't even look his way. Instead, she continued her directive without breaking rhythm. "Simone," she said, "issue an immediate permanent ban on Howard Gaines and any associated corporate accounts from all Atlas Aero Executive Services." "Confirmed," Simone's voice replied. "Ban logged, client profile revoked, corporate account flagged for executive review." Howard's face drained of color as he absorbed the finality of what had just occurred. Ava allowed a brief pause, letting the consequences of her words settle fully into the bones of the room, before she continued. "Further," she said, her tone as steady as ever, "effective immediately, Atlas Aero Executive will implement the equity protocol across all divisions. Mandatory anti-bias training for all staff, real-time audits of passenger complaints, removal of internal discretion for profile-based removals. No more unchecked silence. No more coded language. No more convenient omissions." Devin Walsh let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his posture easing but his expression filled with quiet respect. Across the aisle, Tara Monroe nodded slowly, her arms uncrossed now, her face reflecting a mix of satisfaction and relief. Nia Turner leaned forward, her voice soft but resolute as she addressed Ava directly for the first time. "It feels different already," she said simply. Ava turned toward her, offering the faintest smile. An acknowledgement, not a victory lap. "This is how change begins," she replied quietly. "Not as a policy on paper, but as a moment." Victor Crane took one final step forward, speaking without defensiveness but with heavy sincerity. "Ms. Carter, I understand. I won't fight this decision. I was wrong." Ava inclined her head once, not to forgive, not to dismiss, but to recognize his words for what they were, a confession long overdue. Then she rose from her seat at last, standing tall, every inch the leader they had failed to recognize when she first boarded this aircraft in simple clothes, without the armor of status symbols. Her presence filled the aisle, not as an imposition, but as a rightful reclamation of space she had owned all along. She looked around the room, her gaze clear and steady. "This isn't about embarrassment or retribution," she said calmly. "This is about culture, and that culture ends today." And with that, the dismissed crew began quietly gathering their belongings, one by one, moving down the narrow aisle, stripped of the authority they had wielded so carelessly just minutes before. As they passed Ava Carter, none dared meet her gaze. The passengers watched, not as spectators to a scene of humiliation, but as witnesses to something rare, dignity restoring itself. Not with noise or spectacle, but with deliberate, measured action. The dismissed crew made their way slowly down the aisle, their footsteps oddly muted against the plush carpet, as if the aircraft itself refused to amplify their exit. No one spoke as Captain Mark Stanton passed, his shoulders tight and his gaze fixed straight ahead, refusing even a final glance backward. Susan Bell followed, her composure long gone, her hands trembling as she clutched her belongings close. Victor Crane, once so sure of himself, lingered near the rear of the cabin, pausing for a moment as though wrestling with something he could no longer ignore. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted completely. It no longer pulsed with tension or arrogance, but hummed with a quiet clarity, the passengers absorbing the full magnitude of what they had witnessed. Then a voice broke the stillness, an unexpected, aged voice from the very back row. "Mind if I speak?" The words came slowly but carried the weight of long years behind them. Heads turned as an older white man rose gently from his seat, steadying himself with one hand on the armrest, a well-worn pilot's cap tucked under his other arm. The embroidered name patch on his jacket read, "Miles Hartley." His hair was white and thin, his posture a little stooped, but his eyes were clear and focused as he addressed the cabin. Not just Ava, but everyone. Ava Carter met his gaze, offering a nod of acknowledgement. "Go ahead, Mr. Hartley." Miles took a breath, his voice roughened by age but steady. "I flew jets for 32 years before I retired," he said, looking around at the faces watching him. "Back when a commercial captain got called a hero just for landing on time." A ripple of faint, bitter-sweet smiles passed through the cabin, humor softening a hard moment, if only briefly. "But I didn't stand today," Miles continued, his voice growing heavier, "and I need to admit why." The cabin grew still again, passengers leaning forward, sensing that something deeper was about to be shared. "I trained Paul Kendrick years ago," he said, his gaze distant now, as if watching old memories unspool in front of him. "I taught him to fly, taught him protocol. But I also taught him something else I wish I hadn't. I told him, when in doubt, trust your instinct." He paused, his next words landing with profound honesty. "The thing is, my instinct was trained in a world that never trusted people who looked like you, Miss Carter." The simplicity of that sentence sent a ripple through the room, a quiet gasp from one corner, a hand to the mouth from another. "And I passed that on," Miles admitted, voice catching slightly. Every subtle hesitation, every sideways glance, every question asked without cause. Paul didn't invent those. I did. I modeled them, taught them, rewarded them. His gaze dropped briefly to the floor before he looked back up, his eyes meeting Ava's directly. So, I'm not just apologizing for sitting quietly today. I'm apologizing for what I set in motion long before this flight ever left the ground. A long pause followed, filled not with awkwardness but with weight. A weight that felt real, necessary, and earned. Ava Carter did not speak right away. She let the confession settle into the space it deserved, watching the faces around her as they processed not just Miles's admission, but the uncomfortable truth that prejudice, often disguised as instinct, was something taught, learned, and passed down like an unspoken inheritance. Then, finally, she nodded slowly, her voice quiet but resolute. "Thank you, Mr. Hartley," she said. "That's what accountability sounds like when it doesn't come with a headline, when it comes from understanding." Miles inclined his head, then eased himself back into his seat, his expression one of relief, not absolution, but release. But the moment wasn't over yet. Victor Crane stepped forward next, still standing near the exit but turning back to face Ava. His voice was low, almost tentative. "Mr. Carter, there's something I didn't say earlier." Ava gestured gently. "Speak." Victor cleared his throat, his posture less rigid now, almost humble. "Before this flight, there was a checklist update. Looked standard, nothing suspicious. But it was written by Susan Bell. She told me it was a new readiness protocol, one that asked us to make subjective judgments about passengers based on their presentation, dress, demeanor." He swallowed hard. "I didn't question it," he admitted. "I should have. But I didn't understand what it truly meant until today. I thought it was just language. I thought it was protecting the brand." His next words were quiet but damning. "But it was targeting, it was about exclusion, and I enforced it." A sharp breath escaped from Devon Walsh, who stood quietly nearby, his face reflecting a mix of anger and sadness. "So this wasn't just one bad crew," he said aloud, his words directed to everyone, not just Ava. "It was a system." Victor nodded slowly, accepting the truth aloud for the first time. Ava Carter listened carefully, her expression calm but intense, her mind recording every word. Then she addressed him directly. "You're no longer head of cabin security," she said plainly, "but your confession today may have just prevented deeper harm. You will be placed on administrative review, not as punishment, but as reconstruction." Victor straightened slightly, relief and responsibility mingling in his expression. "Understood, and thank you for not burying this." The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed again, not into something triumphant but into something rare, a moment where power met humility, where leadership met humanity. Ava Carter looked across the room one final time before speaking softly. "This isn't just about fixing a policy," she said, her tone quiet but firm. "It's about rewriting a culture where instinct must finally be questioned, where silence is no longer an acceptable reflex." Her words landed gently but firmly, like a verdict rendered by truth itself. And in that moment it became clear to everyone present this flight, which had never left the ground, had still gone somewhere. It had traveled into honesty, an airspace too rarely visited, but one they would not soon forget. Ava Carter remained standing in the aisle as the dismissed crew finally exited, their footsteps receding until the cabin door closed softly behind them. The hush that followed wasn't tense anymore. It was a stillness that felt earned, almost reverent, as the remaining passengers sat absorbing everything they had witnessed. Sunlight streamed gently through the oval windows, casting long golden beams across the leather seats and polished mahogany panels, illuminating the space in a way that made it feel almost transformed. No longer a compartment of exclusion, but a space newly reclaimed. Ava turned slowly, letting her gaze meet each passenger's eyes, not asking for validation, not performing her authority, but simply recognizing them as people who had become witnesses to something larger than any single moment. Her voice was soft but clear as she spoke. "This isn't just about today," she said, allowing the quiet to settle between her words. "This is about the reflexes we carry and the silences we accept. Those end here. No Atlas Aero executive flight will ever depart under unchecked silence again." There was no applause, no one moved. The moment itself required nothing but presence. She looked directly at Nia Turner, who had spoken earlier with such clarity and empathy. Ava's tone softened further, carrying a warmth that felt deeply personal. "Nia," she said, "I understand you design interiors. I've read your work. I want you at Atlas Aero headquarters next month. We're redesigning our fleet, and I want your vision shaping every cabin." Nia's eyes widened, her hand briefly lifting to her mouth, emotion rising fast, but she managed a nod. "I'd be honored," she whispered. A faint smile touched Ava's lips. Not performative, but real. Across the aisle, Devon Walsh leaned forward slightly, his voice hushed but earnest. "This may have been the most honest flight I've ever taken," he said quietly, "and we never even left the ground." A brief ripple of gentle laughter moved through the passengers, a lightness returning, not from relief, but from truth. For the first time since boarding, the atmosphere felt clean. Ava's phone chimed softly at her side, and she lifted it briefly. Simone's voice, calm as ever, came through the speaker. "Ms. Carter, the new Atlas Aero Equity Directive has been distributed to all staff. Real-time monitoring is active. Initial compliance audits will begin within the hour." Ava nodded slightly and replied aloud for all to hear. "Let this moment be the standard, not the exception." Victor Crane, still seated quietly in the back, rose carefully and stepped into the aisle. His face looked different now, unburdened, drained, but sincere. He cleared his throat softly. "Miss Carter, if I may say one last thing?" Ava gestured gently. "You may." Victor's voice was rough but honest. 8 years ago, I worked a flight where a black passenger boarded first class. Well-dressed, polite, ticket in hand. But a flight attendant called me over, said he probably snuck up from coach. I checked his ticket anyway. I didn't think twice. I embarrassed that man without cause, and I didn't log it. I buried it." His gaze lifted, meeting Ava's directly. "And I realize now, that's where this started for me. That instinct, unexamined. Today, you didn't just stop me from removing you. You stopped me from carrying that legacy forward." Ava listened carefully, then gave a small but meaningful nod. "Confession isn't weakness," she said gently. "It's reconstruction." Victor nodded, emotion rising in his expression, but he didn't try to speak again. He simply returned quietly to his seat. Ava turned back toward the rest of the cabin and addressed everyone, not as CEO, not even as the person wronged, but as a leader, setting a tone that would ripple far beyond this single aircraft. Single aircraft. "What happened today isn't just mine to carry," she said, her voice low and steady. "It belongs to all of you. Because you didn't stay silent. You spoke. You stood. And that's what breaks patterns." She paused, scanning the faces in front of her. "This plane won't fly today," she continued softly. "It isn't ready. But the next time it does, it will lift off under a different sky. One where respect doesn't depend on appearances, And dignity isn't something you have to prove. A hush followed, not of discomfort but of deep absorption. The final shaft of sunlight moved across her seat, touching the headrest gently as if sealing the transformation that had just occurred. Then she made one last announcement, her voice quiet but carrying a sense of closure. "Thank you all for not looking away." And with that, Ava Carter sat down, not in triumph but in resolve, her posture steady, her gaze forward. The jet remained on the tarmac unmoving, but in truth this flight had already traveled farther than most would ever understand. It had crossed into something new, a future earned by courage, not hashtags, not headlines, with human voices.